What up, NGConf? How you guys doing? My name is Jeff Welpley. I'm the CTO at GetHuman.
And I'm Patrick Stapleton of Angular Class.
You may also know us from our weekly podcast called Angular Air. Over the past year, Patrick and I have been working on a library called Angular Universal that allows you to render your Angular 2 web app on the server. The way this works is that if a user clicks on a link or types in the URL for your web app in their browser, they get a server view rendered by Angular Universal immediately with the initial server response. So users looking at that server view almost immediately, and then all of the client-side JavaScript is downloaded in the background. And then eventually it bootstraps and the client takes over and you're off to the races. So for people that are unfamiliar with server rendering or Angular Universal, I created this handy-dandy decision tree. Do you care about the initial load for performance for your web app? If you have a consumer-facing app or a mobile app, you should care because your users care about seeing something right away. Google has done a number of studies that talk about how the difference of just 250 milliseconds, less than the blink of an eye, can make a huge difference in the drop-off rate for users on your app. Do you care about users finding you through search engines? Google does a good job of indexing client-side rendered HTML, but it's not perfect. And other search engines like Bing don't do it nearly as well. So server rendering is still the best way to optimize your website for search engines. And finally, do users share links to your app on social media? On Facebook, on Twitter, that link preview feature only uses server rendered content. It does not render your client-side HTML. Now today, we're going to talk about a lot more than just the Universal Library. We're actually going to talk about the patterns and best practices that Patrick and I discovered over the past year building on top of Angular Universal. The decision tree for that is slightly different. Do you use Angular 2 today, or are you going to use it in the future? I think most of the people in this room probably fit that profile. Do you care about server rendering? If nothing else, are you a web developer? Most people should fit into one of those categories, and these patterns that we're going to talk about do apply. But if you do say no to all of these, I'm not really sure why you're here, but take a nap and we'll wake you up in 18 minutes. So these are the 6 problem areas that Patrick and I identified that we wanted to talk about, but we're going to focus on the top 3 today, and I'm going to go over for each of these what the problem is, and then Patrick is going to show us a code demo of what the solution is. So first up, gap events. So these are user events in the browser on the server rendered view before the client takes over. The client isn't there to handle mouse clicks, swipes, button clicks, typing in text boxes. So if your app is supposed to handle those, it could create a user experience issue. So Patrick, how do we handle this problem with Angular Universal?
Well, let's first go over what's going on here, right? Like remember we type in hello, this is an input in our server rendered view, and then we bootstrap our application. Luckily enough, we have a button here. This is our client-side app. When we hit bootstrap, suddenly our input's gone. The hello is no longer there, and that's mostly because the client's blown away our server view. So let's look at the simplified version of what Preboot is doing internally. So what we're doing is we're grabbing a collection of all of our events right here as an array, and we're invoking record events immediately after the page is loaded. This is simply just grabbing all of our inputs and adding a listener that's pushing all of our events into our collection. And then we have another function here called replay events.
You need to talk louder.
Louder? Talk louder? Can you hear me now? Way louder? Can you guys hear me now? Sweet. All right. And now we have another function called replay events that we're going to invoke right now with this button. Notice how hello is now replayed and our state is now maintained. So let's go on the server and let's implement the full version of Preboot. So we hit save here, and then we do a set timeout to delay our bootstrap, and then as soon as that's done, refresh the page, type in hello. Well, a little bit too much else, but like as soon as the client's rendered, you notice that the state is maintained of our hello app.
So this is something that is extremely useful for server rendering to handle this problem with gap events. But it's also something that can be used for other things, such as with progressive web apps. So Jeff Cross is going to talk later today about progressive web apps. And there's this concept of application shell. So even if you're not using server rendering, you might use this concept of an app shell where you have an initial state for your application. And most of the time, these types of inputs, you just don't have any interactions. But with pre-boot, with this concept of handling the events, recording them, and then playing it back, you could actually add this to progressive web apps and enhance your user's experience. All right, next up is async. So async is not a problem on the client in general, from the sense that you can have things like this, where you have multiple disparate asynchronous events that occur, and they resolve separately, and that's all good on the client in the browser. But on the server, this causes a major problem because we have to know when to send back that response to the client. And most server frameworks will do this by either chaining asynchronous events or having a callback of some sort to say that you're done, okay, send back a response. But unless we want people to totally change the way that they write their web applications, we just can't do that. We have to figure out a way to basically handle all these disparate asynchronous events and coordinate when to send back the response. So Patrick, how does Angular Universal solve this problem?
Well, first, let's look at these asynchronous operations within our application. Notice how we have the same app here and the same set timeout and HTTP requests. Now, if we refresh the page, notice how the server rendered view, it's kind of missing some data here, but the client is able to pick it up. If I bump up the fonts a little bit, you can see that we have a set timeout that's rendered as well as data from the server. Again, refreshing, not there, then it's there. To simply turn this on and keep track of it, we take advantage of Zone.js, and Universal Library itself will take advantage of that. And you only need to do is do async true to set that on. And if I refresh, notice how we have the server rendered view that's doing getting the HTTP calls, and then the client is also doing the same.
So Patrick just changed like a simple flag, right? I mean, that was really easy. But underneath the scenes, there's like some really powerful stuff going on there. Because basically, what we're doing is using the power of Zone.js to track all the asynchronous events and know when they're resolved. It just so happens that this particular pattern can be used in a number of areas as well, including testing. So Julie Ralph is going to talk later in the conference about all the new stuff going on with Protractor and Karma. And the cool thing is that they use this pattern so that you can very easily write asynchronous code in your tests. For those of you that have written JavaScript unit tests before, you know that this can be a pain, and it's completely solved with a lot of the new Protractor and new Karma using Zone.js, the pattern built on top of Zone.js. And finally, dependencies, or more specifically, platform-specific dependencies, such as this, where we're referencing the window and local storage, two things that exist on the browser but do not exist on the server. So if you try to run this code on the server, it's going to fail. And a lot of people that have started to use Angular Universal, they run into this type of issue all the time. And in order to handle this, we have to figure out some way of being able to access local storage, but in a way that doesn't break our app on either side. So Patrick, how do we solve this particular issue?
Yeah. All right. So let's first look at the problem. So if I refresh the page, you can see that our server rendered view is no longer working, but our client rendered view is here. We implemented a store to persist our data. Now, if we look in our application, we created a store using JavaScript, using object literal. The interface is very simple, using a get set. But notice that we have our platform-specific implementation detail in here, the location store, which doesn't work on the server. So let's go over how we would do that within a universal application. And we do that by taking advantage of dependency injection Notice that I am now using DI to inject the store here. And at the top, we're importing store from a universal store that we just created on the fly. And if we look at this implementation detail of source store, we can see that we have a class. Remember that we use the injectable. And then the implementation is the same of get and set. But rather than local storage, we're interacting with a desktop backend. Now that is a dependency of the store. And if we look up at the top, notice that we have the store backend, which is now an abstract class, doesn't really do anything. And that's because we are implementing that per platform and environment. So this is the browser backend. Remember that we're now using local storage here. This is the implementation detail. And if we look at the Node version, we could take advantage of like Redis or any sort of whatever persistence that you want. We could do here. We're just using in-memory store at the moment. And then if we look at the browser, remember that inside of the library or something, you have to export an array of your dependencies, in this case, store. And remember that store is dependent on store backend, right? So store depends on store backend, but we're using dependency injection to say whenever you're instantiating or creating store backend, actually creates browser backend instead. And that's because in the entry point of our application, this is the top level part of our app. This is where we put our platform-specific logic and where we're importing our dependencies. And notice that we're importing our universal application here, and again, importing the browser version of that. And then I guess you could go on the server and see the same thing here. And as soon as we refresh, we'll notice that the server and client rendered are now persisting on both server and client.
So basically, we're pushing all of our platform-specific dependencies to the edge. And just like Dan Waleen talked about in the last talk, we're having an interface in front of that that we're programming against, and that allows us to do this switching depending on what the platform is. And this pattern is the most powerful one that we've talked about today. It's one that all of you will be using at some point with Angular 2. Because it's not just Angular Universal, it's all this other stuff in the new Angular 2 ecosystem. Ionic, NativeScript, Service Worker, Electron. All this stuff is something where you're running your Angular 2 app outside of the traditional browser. And you, at times, will have to have a dependency that does work in one or another, changes or whatever differences between them. Now, even if you are only going to run your Angular 2 web app in the traditional browser, you still are going to use this pattern with testing. Because just like in Angular 1, where you would have your HTTP backend to mock out your calls to HTTP, you would use this same type of idea for mocking any of your different objects and isolating your tests. So it's extremely powerful. So let's recap what we've talked about today. These are the top 3 problems when you're building universal apps. And Angular Universal has a great solution for these. More specifically, patterns built on top of these 3 libraries are really great solutions for these big problems. Pre-boot, Zone.js, and DI. These are the 3 pieces of secret sauce with Angular Universal and Angular 2 itself. In fact, for the rest of this conference, basically every talk is going to have some part of it that is reliant on either zones or DI. They are the foundation of all of Angular 2, the secret sauce for that. So, and they're the reasons why Patrick and I are so excited about Angular Universal and about Angular 2 itself. Thanks a lot, guys. We are going to be here, all week. We want to hear about your stories, and definitely let us know if you have questions or anything like that. So, thanks a lot.
Thanks for having us.